The Institute for Health and Healing is a comprehensive integrative medicine program at Sutter Health, dedicated to healing people and transforming healthcare. Check us out at myhealthandhealing.org or on Facebook.
Welcome, and thank you for joining us. I'm Suzanne Zolfo, Director of Philanthropy for Sutter Valley Medical Foundation. We have a special evening planned for you tonight with Dr. Dale Bredesen and Dr. Akil Palanisamy. Dr. Bredesen will be taking your questions about his program to prevent and even reverse Alzheimer's disease in a conversation with Dr. Palanisamy. At the Institute for Health and Healing, our practitioners recognize that connections between mind, body, spirit, relationships, and the environment impact us in real and unique ways. Here to tell you more about the Institute for Health and Healing is Dr. Maxine Barish-Reeden, co-medical director of the Institute in the Valley. She's an integrative medicine physician and is board certified in internal and integrative medicine. Dr. Barish-Reeden?
Thank you, Suzanne, and thank you to all of you for being here tonight. We're so excited about this evening, and we hope you are too. With your help, Dr. Bredesen and Dr. Palanisamy's approach to integrative medicine, wellness medicine, preventive medicine is going to help all of us to improve our health and our well-being. So hopefully you are familiar with the Institute for Health and Healing, which we affectionately call the IHH. Perhaps you've been a patient here, or you have a family member or loved one, or you know someone who's been here and has had a positive experience, and you want to do more to learn more or to help us to thrive and to expand. We're hoping that you will also be willing to become a donor or to expand your support of us, like my husband and I have done with an initial grant to really launch this fundraising campaign. A little bit of background, I worked as a primary care physician for Sutter for 20 years, but there was always this longing in me to do something more to focus on wellness and prevention, which we don't tend to do in Western medicine. And that really arose in me when I spent 8 months in India in 1976 and got a chance to really explore yoga and mind-body medicine and nutrition. And I came back to college and changed my major to nutrition. And I was on fire about what these kinds of approaches could do to help us be well. Western medicine is useful sometimes, like during COVID. If you're really ill, you want the expertise and the technical skills that are available in a hospital to help save your life. But we have focused a lot more in Western medicine on medication and procedures to treat symptoms rather than really helping people to explore what's in the way of their being well and to help them remove those obstacles on their healing path. So in 2011, I started a fellowship in integrative medicine with Dr. Andrew Weil at the University of Arizona and was inspired to take action. So I made the decision to leave primary care and I started my own little solo integrative medicine practice in Sutter Medical Group with the support of our administrators and physicians. And the demand quickly grew. And in 2016, we joined forces with the Institute for Health and Healing in the Bay Area, and we became the Valley Area IHH. Our demand has continued to grow since then, including many people coming from the Roseville area. And so in 2018, we began to offer acupuncture services at the Sutter Cancer Center on the Sutter Roseville Hospital campus. That demand quickly grew, and last year we added 2 integrative medicine physicians to the mix there, but we're still using space in the cancer center. And about 5 years prior to all of this, there was space that was designated for integrative medicine in the cancer center building on the first floor, but that space was not completed. So now we are in the middle of a campaign to raise the money and finish that space so our clinicians can move in there and have their own home, and also so that we can expand our services, which include acupuncture, traditional Chinese medicine, mind-body medicine, health coaching, nutrition classes, integrative psychotherapy. We have many services to offer our patients now. Getting well again is hard work. It takes patience and perseverance, but with our team as a guide to really help patients choose the healing path that is best for them, we will help you to restore your health. One of the beautiful things about the IHH is our team-based approach. So a patient who comes into the office may see multiple people here, and we may have a team conference and discuss challenging cases and share in our collective wisdom, which helps to enhance what we can offer our patients in terms of the best healing path for them. This is the best of what we call personalized medicine. I hope that this evening is inspiring for you, and I hope that you are inspired to participate in our campaign to expand what we're doing in Roseville. I hope you will join my husband and me in providing the support that we need to do this. Please don't hesitate to contact me or Suzanne or anyone on our philanthropy team if you have any questions, if we can help you in any way. Thank you so much, and I turn it back over to Suzanne.
Thank you, Dr. Barish-Reeden, or as we like to call her, Dr. Max. You know, the Institute for Health and Healing is a unique resource in our community. In fact, on average, there are 1,000 people waiting to see our IHH practitioners. It can take up to 3 months for a new patient to be able to get in to see one of our integrative medicine physicians. We just don't have the space to see more patients. We must expand. The space that Dr. Max spoke about in Roseville is just waiting to be transformed into the new IHH clinic. In addition to improving access to care, this expansion will accomplish another goal, which is to add to the depth and breadth of treatment modalities that patients can receive at IHH. Treatments like osteopathic manipulation, which require a dedicated room with specialized equipment, but we just don't have that room right now. Sutter Health is a nonprofit healthcare system. That means that all of our net profits go into building and maintaining our facilities, purchasing new equipment, and supporting programs in our communities. But programs like this take a little bit of extra money to move forward. And it's no secret that COVID-19 has and will continue to have a significant financial impact on healthcare systems, including Sutter Health. That's why community support is so important right now to be able to open this new clinic. The sooner we can raise the money, the sooner we can start seeing more patients in Roseville, people like you. I'm very grateful to Dr. Max and to her husband, Dr. Don Reeden, for the personally significant gift that they have made to this fundraising campaign. In fact, we have received a matching grant of $1 million, so that the first $1 million we raise will be matched dollar for dollar. But we must hit this goal by July 31st of 2021 in order to receive that matching money. So it's critically important that you really think about the importance of the IHH in our community. I'm very grateful to know that we have the support of many of you who are here with us tonight. And I hope that we can count on the rest of you to really step forward and help us out with this campaign. Remember that the geographic location of this clinic is just part of the story. This is about improving access and adding different modalities of treatment for our patients, expanding the services that we provide. My foundation colleagues and I will be happy to meet with you to discuss how you might participate in our fundraising campaign. Thank you, and back to you, Dr. Barish-Reeden.
So now it is my great honor and privilege to introduce you to Dr. Dale Bredesen and Dr. Akil Palanisamy. Dr. Bredesen is an internationally recognized expert in the field of neurodegenerative diseases. He's also the founding president and CEO of the Buck Institute for Research on Aging in the Bay Area. He is an adjunct professor at UCSF, and he's a New York Times bestselling author. Dr. Akil Palanisamy is a Harvard-trained integrative medicine physician here at the IHH in Sacramento. He blends his Western medical training with holistic approaches, including functional medicine, as well as Ayurvedic medicine, which is the traditional medicine of India. Thank you both for leading us in this special evening.
Thank you so much for the wonderful introduction. So welcome everyone to tonight's Sutter Health Institute for Health and Healing evening program, a follow-up to our Medical School in Integrative Medicine. I'm Dr. Akil Palanisamy, Integrative Medicine physician in our Sacramento clinic and physician director for community education throughout all of our locations. And I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Dale Bredesen to join me in conversation tonight for our program. So welcome, Dr. Bredesen.
Thanks very much, Dr. Palanisamy.
So tonight we're going to be talking about Alzheimer's disease, and we're really thrilled to have this intimate conversation with all of you who are tuning in, and we very much want to hear your questions. So the way to submit questions, if you're new to Zoom, the platform we're using tonight, so at the bottom of your screen, there is an icon which says chat, and you can basically type in your question in that chat box by clicking there, and we'll be taking your questions throughout the evening. So please feel free to enter your questions at that point. And so Dr. Bredesen, I think not everyone was able to see your video talk, and I wanted to start with some basics about Alzheimer's. And when I was in medical school, I remember we were taught that it was basically the amyloid plaques and tangles that created Alzheimer's disease, and that that was essentially what was all there is. And I think with your revolutionary approach, you showed us that there's so much more to it than just plaques and tangles, right?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Akil. So many of the things we learned about in medical school were diseases that we really didn't understand. I mean, they're given names like lupus or Parkinson's or Alzheimer's, but that doesn't tell you what's actually causing it. And that's been a huge issue in Alzheimer's disease, because people talk about it's due to amyloid, as you said. They talk about it's due to misfolded proteins, reactive oxygen species, lipid effects. I mean, on and on and on and on, prions, all these sorts of things. But so we spent 30 years in the laboratory looking at what actually drives the molecular process that leads to what we call Alzheimer's disease. And what we found is that there are many different contributors. So this is, as you know, a complex chronic illness, fundamentally different than something like pneumococcal pneumonia, where there's one organism, one disease, and you get rid of that organism. In this case, there are many different contributors, and we initially identified 36 different contributors. So you want to look at those things to see what's actually driving this. All these other things, amyloid, prions, all these things, these are mediators of the biochemical process ongoing in the brain in response to the insults that you are responding to when you are developing Alzheimer's.
Yes, and I found it interesting when I think you mentioned in your book as well that sometimes patients have significant levels of amyloid and plaques and tangles, but they actually don't have Alzheimer's. So is that possible?
Very common. Now, tangles are more associated with the decline, and they tend to come later than the earliest amyloid. But the amyloid, many people, yes, are found to have amyloid, and in some cases, tangles as well, without significant cognitive decline. So we now know that this is a process. You get a diagnosis of Alzheimer's after about 20 years after the initial pathophysiology, which can be detected by a PET scan or be detected by spinal fluid. So it really takes quite some time. And so the good news is there's quite a window there where you can do a lot in prevention, and then the earliest symptoms, which are called SCI, or for subjective cognitive impairment, which may last a decade in and of itself, followed by the next phase, which is called MCI, mild cognitive impairment, which may last a few years. Typically 5 to 10% of people with MCI will now convert to Alzheimer's. And by definition, as you know, it's called Alzheimer's when someone begins to lose their activities of daily living. So what we call Alzheimer's disease is really the very, very late stages of a process that we can do a lot about prior to that, and even sometimes during that, as we've seen time and time again.
And the disease of Alzheimer's has been with us for thousands of years. And I believe in your talk, you also alluded to the fact that Ayurvedic physicians and in Ayurveda, they had touched on it as well. Could you speak to that aspect?
Yeah, that's a really good point, Akil. So, we published a paper in 2015 showing that if you look at large data sets, you look at more biochemistry, you can actually see that there are these subtypes of Alzheimer's. There's a type that's mostly inflammatory. There's a type that's mostly atrophic. There's a type that's mostly glycotoxic. There's another one that's toxic due to biotoxins. So we described these, we thought, wow, this is really exciting. Well, it turned out that the Ayurvedic physicians, as you said, for thousands of years ago, had already shown that there are these different subgroups of dementia. So we realized that we've been scooped by a few thousand years.
Right. I think, yes, in Ayurveda, they really emphasize that every disease, not just Alzheimer's, has many distinct subtypes. And they believe that therapy should be customized to each person based on the unique type of that disease that they have, whether it's Alzheimer's or diabetes or asthma. And, I think it's very interesting to see that ancient wisdom and modern science sort of coming together with that customized understanding of disease.
I think that's one of the most important points in the whole ongoing 21st century medical revolution. We were all taught, if we trained back in the 20th century, that in fact the idea was you make a diagnosis, you find out what it is, then you write a prescription or you have surgery done, and that's the approach to all these different diseases. But in fact, we're no longer, for the vast majority of us at least, are now dying, unfortunately, of complex chronic illnesses. They are much too complex for a simple prescription pad. And that's why things like simple drugs against Alzheimer's have really not had an effect. So you really have to look at all the different contributors. Now it's not about what it is, the diagnosis, it's about why it is. What are all the different contributors? And if you're going to impact things like Alzheimer's, you're going to have to identify those contributors and then address each one. And we're actually doing that now in the first clinical trial in history for cognitive decline, in which instead of predetermining a treatment, you look at each person and you look at this large data set and then say, okay, here are the things driving the process for each person and going after those. And this will be completed in December. So very excited to have that published next year.
Yeah, I think that's going to be really exciting to see that, that paper coming out. So I think that people always focus on diet because it's very tangible and it's something that we're all very passionate about it, the Institute for Health and Healing. So I was wondering if you could share more about your dietary approach that you recommend.
It's a great point. So when I trained at Duke Medical School, there was one single course on nutrition offered to medical students, and it was optional. You didn't have to take it. I did take it, and I learned one thing, which is that vitamin C is thermolabile. That's it. So we really came away with the idea that diet has little to do with disease. You want to diagnose what it is, you want to write a prescription, and you want to move on. And it really took going through the lab, all the years in the lab, we were looking at, okay, what can we do now that we're beginning to understand the underlying process? How can we impact those various contributors? And guess what? It turned out that diet, among other things, is a very powerful impactor on those processes. So we're again just going, I'm no nutrition expert, I'm just going by the biochemistry of neurodegeneration. So people have the best outcomes when you combine several things, which we just put into a diet. So these people need to get into ketosis. And in fact, you can look at a PET scan for someone for 10 years before a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, you can see that they don't have appropriate glucose utilization in the temporal and parietal regions. So there is an energy gap, really an energy emergency when someone is developing this disease. And I should say, the bottom line with this disease we call Alzheimer's is that it is an insufficiency. There's not enough support based on the demand. And so things are downsizing, very much like we've seen with COVID-19. We've all been told to go in, shelter in place because there's an insult out there. And what's happened? We've been plunged into a recession. This is exactly what's happening in your brain when you have cognitive decline. You are downsizing because of insults or threats. And so, yes, for diet, number one, you need to get into ketosis, typically 1 to 4 millimolar beta hydroxybutyrate. Number two, you need to have time for autophagy, for essentially cleaning of the brain, which is why we typically suggest that there be a fasting period of 12 to 16 hours at night. And then, people have used this for all sorts of things. It improves your blood pressure, it improves your insulin sensitivity, all these sorts of things. Then the third thing, you need to have insulin sensitivity. There are about 100 million Americans, as you know, who are insulin resistant. It's one of the most common problems. It's essentially a precursor to type 2 diabetes down the road. And this has been one of the most important risk factors for cognitive decline of Alzheimer's disease. And so you need to become insulin sensitive when most people start out with insulin resistance. So that's the third piece. The fourth thing is you need to have a high fiber diet. So this is a plant rich, doesn't have to be completely plants. You fish, great. Pastured chicken, fine, as long as you don't have high arsenic chicken. Grass-fed beef, these things are all fine. Some pastured eggs, these are all great. Getting you, one of the common problems is not enough choline, which is a huge issue for cognition because this is the precursor for the important neurotransmitter acetylcholine, which is critical for memory. So you have to hit these different marks biochemically to get the best outcomes, both in terms of prevention and reversal. And we have documented hundreds of people now and published 100 just a year ago who've had cognitive improvement. And this is now, this has been something that was unheard of in the past. And yet we see people not only improve, but sustain their improvement. We have a person now 8.5 years on this who's still doing very, very well at the age of 76. So those are the general features of the diet, and we can go into specifics, but those are the biochemical targets of any diet that's going to be optimal for cognition.
That's fantastic. Thank you. And I know that in addition to what to eat, which we can talk about more, the timing of meals is important as well. So could you speak about what you recommend for the meal timing and the fasting windows?
Absolutely. And so, what we recommend, this is called Keto Flex 12-3. So we're driving you into mild ketosis. It's flexitarian. You can have some meat or not. And 12-3 means a minimum of 12 hours fast between finishing dinner and starting breakfast, brunch, or lunch, and a minimum of 3 hours between finishing your evening meal and going to bed. You don't want to eat and jump right into bed because you still got your insulin levels cranked up. The other thing that's come up related to this, as you know, is the continuous glucose monitoring, CGMs, things like Freestyle Libre and things like that. These have been very helpful because people find not only what they're doing to spike their glucose, which is again horrible for your cognition, but also when they now go to bed, what happens? Now it actually drops too low. And many people who didn't realize, why am I waking up at 2 or 3 in the morning? They find out, oh, guess what? My glucose dropped to 45, far too low. Both of these things are actually real liabilities for sustaining optimal cognition.
Great. And with the fasting window and intermittent fasting, you probably saw in the news about the recent study where they looked at intermittent fasting and found that it was associated with the loss of lean muscle mass and did not lead to overall weight loss. So there was a lot of controversy that, is it true that intermittent fasting is not as beneficial as we thought? I'm curious what your take is on that.
Yeah, and sure, of course, Dr. Walter Longo, who I've known for many years, has done beautiful work on intermittent fasting and its effects on multiple parameters from blood pressure to cognition to muscle, et cetera, and of course its effect on cancer was what he was originally studying. So yes, you're absolutely right, and as you know, a lot of functional medicine, integrative medicine is about the fact that you're putting together a whole system. So it's essentially like you're constructing an orchestra. And so people will say, well, look, we played the violins alone and it didn't sound like an orchestra. No, not the violin. You got to have the timpani, you got to have the clarinets, you got to have everything. You got to have the woodwinds, you got to have everything. And it's the same thing with this diet approach. It's the same thing with an entire protocol. You have to do all the pieces together. So yes, if you don't do anything else right, and you just do intermittent fasting, no surprise, you have some side effects. Now, I should say the side effects aren't as bad as some of the drugs you may take, but you do have let's say a suboptimal, an imperfect outcome. So yes, this is why you have to determine, for example, is your BMI high, is your BMI low? So if you are very, very thin, for example, then you need to cycle a couple of times a week out of that ketosis to make sure that you don't lose too much weight. Because most people will lose anything from 10 to 40 pounds without dieting, just by going on a ketogenic diet, as you know. And so, yes, I'm not surprised that just that alone may have resulted in some muscle loss. But remember that we're dealing with a disease that is a terminal illness. So either when someone comes in with cognitive decline or at risk for cognitive decline, either we're going to help them or they're going to die. And so we really want to do everything possible to get them on the right side. And this is what our research over the years showed, that there is essentially a balance. You can look at actually the molecular part of the balance with amyloid precursor protein, and this thing will go one direction toward making and keeping synapses, making and keeping connections in the brain if things are good. And on the other hand, if things are bad, the same molecule will actually mediate a downsizing of your brain. And therefore, yes, we want to do everything possible to get people back onto the good side. And they do in general, and we've seen this again and again and again. They do better if they get into mild ketosis. Now, there are two ways to do that, as you know. There's exogenous ketosis. You can take ketones, things like ketone salts or esters. And there's endogenous ketosis, where you're generating it from your own fat. And again, if you don't have some fat, that's harder, of course. So at the beginning, we suggest go ahead and do it exogenously. It's not in the long run as good, as helpful as doing it endogenously, but you're starting with this deficit. So you want to address that immediately. And many people will just notice, wow, just getting into ketosis has such an effect. And of course, Dr. Mary Newport has written books about this and the effects it had on her own husband, who had Alzheimer's, just getting into ketosis. Then over a couple of months, you can now get slowly into endogenous ketosis, which is preferable to exogenous ketosis. But there have been papers published, again, both of those things, showing improvements in cognition. So you don't want to leave that part out.
That makes a lot of sense. And continuing in the same vein with the topic of fats, I think that often with my patients that I see in the clinic, that's a common source of confusion because there's so much conflicting information they hear. Are saturated fats harmful, for example? How much saturated fat versus monounsaturated versus polyunsaturated? I'm wondering if you could share your take on healthy fats and what you recommend.
It's a great point. And again, it depends. If you have insulin resistance, if you have a high carbohydrate diet, then saturated fats are a disaster. As you know, there's something we've called it's a little bit like the Bermuda Triangle, but we call it the Berfuda Triangle as a joke, just so people can remember it, because you don't want to combine those three things: saturated fats and low fiber and simple carbs. If you put those three together, you're really asking for trouble. And of course, including vascular disease, including dementia. So again, minimizing saturated fats, but using good fats, as you said, things especially monounsaturates and polyunsaturates, which are very, very helpful. Most people don't realize how important fats are in our diets. And of course, we've heard so much about omega-3s and fish oil and things like that. And of course, fatty fish and how good these are for you. But they're discovering additional fats that turn out to be very helpful. And you know the work of Professor Charles Sirhan from Harvard, who discovered resolvins. Resolvins are another omega-3 cousin, essentially, which also is helpful for resolution of infection. Now, recently, Dr. Goodnow, who is down in Southern California, has discovered and worked on plasmalogens, another type of fat. also critical, also very helpful for cognition. So it's turning out that these things have multiple advantages, and we should absolutely take advantage of those. The real bad actor here is typically simple carbohydrates. It is the sugars that unfortunately we have been, most of us have had far too much exposure to these sugars that are pro-inflammatory, that really support cardiovascular disease, support cognitive decline. These things are a major problem. And really, we were not evolutionarily designed as hominids to metabolize this much sugar. And so that has really been hurting us a lot. So the bottom line is, yes, saturated fats at the right time and in the right amounts, fine. But in the long run, we want to get over to more monounsaturates and polyunsaturates.
Okay, great. And would you also tailor that to the ApoE, subtype?
Very good point. So ApoE4, so as people probably know, ApoE is a gene that we all carry. You have two copies, it's a little bit like blue eyes, brown eyes. You can have ApoE 2, 3, or 4. The primordial one that we all had as hominids 5 to 7 million years ago, which is actually different from our common ancestor, it was ApoE4. So for 96% of our evolution as hominids, we were all ApoE4/4. Just in the last 220,000 years, ApoE3 appeared. And for example, I checked myself, I'm a 3/3, which is kind of vanilla. That's the most common thing. About 75 million Americans, however, have one copy of ApoE4. And what that does is that raises your lifetime risk for Alzheimer's from about 9%, which is what you have if you have no copies of ApoE4, to about 30%, that's for one copy, 75 million Americans, as I mentioned. And then if you have two copies, that's 7 million Americans. You're well over 50%. Most likely you will develop it. And in the past, it's been so backwards. People said, well, don't bother to check because there's nothing you can do. Nothing could be further from the truth. Everybody should know their ApoE status because there's a tremendous amount you can do. And in fact, there's a very nice website started by an ApoE4/4 individual who's done extremely well and reversed her cognitive decline and doing the protocol that we developed. And it's called apoe4.info. So we want to make sure that we prevent this in all of these people. And as you indicated or alluded to, yes, they do actually absorb fat. That's one of the things that happens by having ApoE4 positivity. Great if you're roaming around the savannah 5 million years ago. It's great because you don't have to eat as often. It's also great because it is a pro-inflammatory gene, which helps you to eat raw meat, to kill off infections. You have fewer infections, all those sorts of things. And actually, we discovered that this actually redirects the transcription of your DNA. So it actually changes your cells into more of a protective mode. Unfortunately, as you know, it also increases your risk for cardiovascular disease and increases your risk for Alzheimer's disease. And so you have to do the appropriate things, appropriate anti-inflammatories, appropriate things with fat absorption. So in general, yes, you want to stay away if you're ApoE4 positive from saturated fats, even more than if you're ApoE4 negative. And this is why we typically recommend for those people, when you're going to do the exogenous ones, simply use ketone salts or esters instead of MCT oil or coconut oil or things like that. The bottom line is you can essentially alter your lifestyle a little bit so that you get the same, you get the same advantages as being ApoE4 negative. And in fact, simple example, the magnitude of the effect of one copy of ApoE4 on your risk for Alzheimer's is approximately equal to the magnitude of the effect of routine exercise on reducing your risk. So you can balance these things and actually reduce your risk substantially. That just beginning with exercise, but including all these other things. And this is what is discussed on apoe4.info because you have 3,500 people who are all doing this sort of thing.
That's fantastic. Thank you. So we're going to switch gears now and take questions from the audience. And so I just want to encourage everyone to post your questions in the chat. We want this to be really interactive. So whatever comes to mind, please share. And then I also want to say that for everyone watching, you'll be getting a copy of Dr. Bredesen's latest book, The End of Alzheimer's Program. And he has really a wealth of information in here, much more detailed nutrition advice. So we're going to shift off nutrition to some other topics, but I just wanted to let everyone know you'll be getting a copy of that. So let me go to the first question from one of the attendees, which is, what are your thoughts about fruits, berries, sources of antioxidants, and do we need supplements instead?
Yeah, it's a great point. And again, you're going to adjust depending on whether you're symptomatic or asymptomatic. Everyone sees the same thing. It's easier to prevent decline than it is to reverse decline. It's easier to reverse decline early than it is to reverse it as it gets later and later. Yes, we've seen some people with MoCA scores of 0, that's Montreal Cognitive Assessment, of 0 who improved, but that's the exception. Whereas the people who are early on, pretty much everybody gets better when you do the optimal things. So absolutely, the supplements can be helpful. Ultimately, but using those, again, it depends how far along you are. And we've actually developed some that have the combinations that are optimal. But again, the goal here is to have the best outcomes and the best biochemistry to drive you into this mildly ketotic state where you have enough energy, you have enough blood flow, you have enough oxygenation. And again, something everyone's thinking about because of COVID-19, oxygenation being a huge issue now. All of these things are critical for optimal cognition. So, so again, you have to base this on where do you stand overall.
That makes sense. We have a follow-up question about the ApoE subtype. So people are asking how they can determine their own ApoE subtype. Is it something that your primary care physician can order, or how can they get that kind of genetic testing?
Yes, very simple. You can get it from your primary care, or you can also do it yourself directly. And you can do it, there's a number of places. You can do it with 23andMe. You can do it with mycognoscopy.com. You can do it with, there are several other sites as well. So this is basically looking at your genetics. And good, again, very important. It's the most common genetic risk factor when it comes to cognitive decline.
Great. Question about how do you get into ketosis? Is it primarily just increasing the fat intake in the beginning, or could you speak to that?
Yeah, that's a great point. And so you want to combine a couple of things. So the whole idea here is that we're made to go back and forth, to have metabolic flexibility, to be able to burn the carbohydrates that we take in. So if we're, go back to, 10,000 years, people eating roots and things like that, those are the carbohydrates. Okay, you can burn those. But then, of course, you go through times when you're not getting those carbohydrates. And so our body would then shift into burning its own fat and would then produce these ketones. The good news is the brain can metabolize both. However, what's happened is we're now living in a society where there's so much carbohydrate and it's there all the time that we're rarely burning our fat. And we actually get to the point where we're metabolically inflexible. So we're not capable of making and keeping these. So it takes a little time, and people even can get what's called the keto flu, because as you're now going down on your glycogen storage, this is where you store your carbohydrates in your liver and in your muscle, then in fact, you can actually, for example, diurese too much. You can get low on your volume, so you got to be careful not to get too dried out. But as you indicated, Akil, it's the combination of a low carbohydrate, high good fats, and intermediate protein diet. Typically 70, 20, 10, that sort of thing. And in fact, there's a nice thing that anyone can use called Chronometer. It's a free thing you can use on your computer. And I've been doing that during COVID-19 to see, where do I stand with each thing, and found that, hey, I'm not getting enough choline intake, for example. So you want to have the majority of your calories coming from good fats, and then intermediate from protein and good protein, obviously. And then you want to have a very small from carbs and as close to 0 as possible from sugars. So that's the way that you then get it. Now, again, at the beginning, it may take a little bit of days to a week or two to get into that. So during that time, you can, and again, if you've got symptoms, it's important, take some exogenous ketones for a few weeks or even a month or two to help you get that ketone level that's appropriate. And you can now measure that ketone level either with a breathalyzer, or you can measure it with a blood stick, with things like precision extra, things like that. So there are ways to measure this that are pretty simple so that you can follow yourself. And as you know, Akil, there's more and more now on quantified self. We can all check our ketones, our glucose, our heart rate variability. The new Apple Watch has your oxygen saturation at night. You can see how your sleeping is going with an Oura ring, so on and on and on. So it's easier and easier for all of us to follow these various parameters that are so critical for our outcomes.
Question about the role of stress. How does stress impact the brain, and then also do mind-body approaches help then as a result?
Yeah, this is so important, and as a scientist who ran a lab for 30 years, I have to say I used to laugh at the idea that, oh yeah, stress, okay, yeah, it's one thing, but it's not that important. Mind, body, what is all this stuff? This is all put a crystal on your forehead, all that stuff. It turns out, I was wrong. And it turns out the data are unquestionable. For example, meditation has been shown to help with blood pressure, with neuroplasticity, with vascular status, on and on. And again, with these looking at these various parameters easily now, you can see these changes. So absolutely no question. And we have a number of people, for example, whose cognition literally will rise and fall with their stress levels. When the stress is high, the cognition goes down. When the stress is low, the cognition is better again. And no question that these mind-body approaches are very helpful. The thing is that you want to pair them, if you've got pathogens that are untreated, for example, if you have P. gingivalis that is getting into your brain. That's one of the things that's been found in the brains of Alzheimer's patients. You want to know about it. So the whole point is we've got a large arsenal. We want to use all the things at our disposal to get best outcomes. This old-fashioned idea that, I'm just going to give you a medicine because there's nothing I can do. This is 20th century thinking. We want to now come into the 21st century. This is a century of data-driven and systems-driven approaches as opposed to monotherapies. And as part of that overall system, there is so many things. We've been told there's nothing you can do about this. In fact, it's the opposite. There are so many things. You have to know how to use them, how to drive them. So mind-body practices are absolutely a part for that, and especially for people who are under stress. And as you know, anxiety, insomnia, depression, all related. These are all related to stress. These are all related to trying to overdrive a neural system. And so pulling back on that, relaxing things, absolutely. Part of the response that we call Alzheimer's is a response to threat.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think the more we learn about the power of mind-body approaches, the more it seems that's just so fundamental. And I really think everyone should have some type of practice, whether that be meditation or yoga or breathing techniques, that they can do, especially now with the pandemic as well. Absolutely. So I think that's obviously one thing that is very beneficial for prevention. So what would you say are three things that everyone can or should do to prevent Alzheimer's, just to keep their brain in optimal health?
Yeah, I get asked this all the time. What's the one thing or the two things or the three things? And this is a big topic. This is like saying, what are the three things I can do to stay healthy? Because we're really talking about a healthy brain. So what I always say is the number one thing is to get evaluated. So we've set up pre-code, which is for prevention of cognitive decline, and recode, which is for reversal of cognitive decline. And you can get access to those online. So the idea is you need to know where you stand. So you need to know, do you have insulin resistance? If so, that's a risk factor for you. Just like checking your lipid panel to look at your status, your likelihood of cardiovascular disease. The brain is a little more complicated, but it's the same idea. So you need to know if you have ongoing insulin resistance. You need to know if you have ongoing systemic inflammation. That's another important one. You need to know if you have specific toxins that are present. Unfortunately, so many of us have been exposed to toxins and we're unaware of it. you need to know if you have low levels of hormones, growth factors, or nutrients. These are all critical. So getting evaluated is number one. But if you want to look at things that everyone can do, irrespective of what their risk factors are, I would have to say that probably the most important of all are to check your sleep. That turns out to be incredibly common. Alzheimer's affects sleep, gives you poorer sleep, and guess what? Poorer sleep gives you Alzheimer's. So in fact, these things unfortunately are in a vicious circle. And so you do need to optimize this. And we find that so many people that we evaluate drop their oxygenation status at night. When you go to sleep at night, your oxygenation should be 96 to 98% saturation, as you know, Akil. And you can check this with things like Better, or now with the new Apple Watch, lots of ways. Or you can have your doctor do a sleep study, lots of ways, or have him or her lend you an oximeter. Any of these things, very important. And so many people find actually they're too low on this. That is associated with brain atrophy. Some nice publications a few years ago showing that there's a direct correlation between how much your oxygen is dropping at night and the size of specific nuclei within your brain. So this is an important thing to say. So I'd say that's the second thing: evaluation, sleep. And then the third thing is it would be between exercise and diet. So I would say, let's say lifestyle. You still need to look at your toxins. You still need to look at your pathogens, because there are chronic pathogens that are causing you. Remember that the amyloid that we associate with Alzheimer's is part of your innate immune system. So again, just like COVID-19 has shrunk the risk factors down to 2 weeks. What's 20 years in Alzheimer's? But it's the same idea. It's an immune system that is now stuck in inflammation, and this is a major problem. So those are critical. But I would say, lifestyle. So making sure that you're eating the right things, that you're getting exercise. It's incredibly important to get exercise regularly. And there's something interesting called EWOT, which I really like, exercise with oxygen therapy. You're really driving oxygenation to the far reaches of your brain, and then you're getting essentially the best of both worlds with increased oxygen, but then you are actually pulling it away for a couple of minutes and then cycling. During those times, your brain's actually producing increasing trophic factors that are allowing you to improve oxygenation for the future. So I would say those three things: evaluation, sleep, and overall lifestyle are all critical. You could add things like brain training, but I would say those are probably the big three.
Okay, that's great. So we have a question. I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer, but maybe from your experience, you can speak to this. It's about insurance. Will most insurance companies cover the tests you recommend to check our brain health, such as the PET scan, et cetera, especially if we don't have a diagnosis of Alzheimer's or cognitive decline?
Yeah, this is a great point. What will insurance cover? What will it not cover? And so far, most insurance groups have decided that they're not covered. Of course, they're in business to make money, so they're going to cover as little as possible. Okay, that's that. It's a business, and so we would like them to realize that, in fact, we'll all save money if we keep people out of nursing homes. Now, the Alzheimer's Association has pointed out the average amount that we spend from diagnosis to death in Alzheimer's is $350,000 per person. And a lot of that is nursing home. Nursing homes are typically $100,000 per year, some of them $250,000 a year. So they're in that range. They can be a little less or they can be a lot more, but that's a very, very high expense. So my argument is always, you're going to save yourself a tremendous amount by staying out of a nursing home. And so it's actually quite a good investment. I'm hoping that in the long run, insurance companies will cover this. And they already do cover things like PET scans are covered for people, and all of these have specific rules, as you know. If there's a question about the diagnosis, is it frontotemporal dementia, is it Alzheimer's, then these are typically covered. The FDA, of course, has recently approved the tau PET scan. So I think that is going to become covered if it's not already. So there are these things that can be covered. Some of the laboratory work is covered. But for many of these things, again, there's no incentive for the insurance company to cover what actually helps you. There's only an incentive to cover what will make them money.
Right. And I would add also that from the perspective of functional medicine and integrative medicine, a lot of the tests that you mentioned are relevant not just to brain health, but also to other conditions, immune health, gut health. And so, for example, certain labs that do functional testing of the gut microbiome or testing for food sensitivities or testing for toxins, that might be covered depending on, for example, Medicare covers certain labs to do that kind of testing. And so even though it's not specific for Alzheimer's, you don't need a diagnosis of Alzheimer's, but if you have other symptoms and are coming in, for example, irritable bowel syndrome or chronic fatigue or other symptoms, a lot of the tests can be ordered that way and they will still be relevant for brain health. So I wanted to mention that as well.
Absolutely.
Okay, so question about, we have heard about the different kinds of Alzheimer's and the subtypes. How was that discovered and what does that mean?
Yeah, it's a great point. So this goes back to our looking at the actual drivers of the illness, and you can see that APP, the amyloid precursor protein, and I showed this in the talk before, actually is this master switch. You can actually drive it one way, and there are all sorts of things that feed into that, or you can drive it another way. And so we started to look at all the things that are driving. For example, you can follow the molecular pathway from activation of inflammatory pathways. NF-kappa B is a well-known inflammatory pathway that plays directly on APP and puts it on the Alzheimer's side. On the other hand, growth factors and things that support the brain, like estradiol, great example. Estrogen binds to its receptor, which enters the nucleus, has impact on hundreds of genes. And one of these is the one that comes out and cuts APP to give it the positive signaling that supports the brain, supports the connections, which is, of course, why people, when that's reduced rapidly, often have brain fog. So there are these things, and as we started to look at people and measure these various things, we could see that there were these different ways that you get. So in other words, you end up at the same place, but you start with different pathways to get there. And in one case, we saw that there are lots of people where the predominant problem is really increased inflammation. And so we called this type 1 or hot or inflammatory Alzheimer's. Whereas there was a second group, completely different. They look different, they act differently. And these are people who have a type 2 or atrophic Alzheimer's. They tend to be a little bit older. They don't have any inflammation ongoing. They just don't have the support with the growth factors, hormones, and nutrients. And you can now replenish those and help them. They do quite well. And again, they look different. And then when we looked at those two groups, we found that, wait a minute, there's something missing here, because those groups responded well to dealing with those problems. But there were people then that didn't respond, and we thought, what's going on here? So we started looking into their histories, and we ultimately realized these are people who had tremendous exposure to various toxins. And these come in three groups. It's the inorganics, things like mercury and air pollution and things like that. And it's the organics, things like benzene, toluene, formaldehyde, glyphosate, all those sorts of things. And then it's the biotoxins, things like toxins made by specific mold species. These are all things that can put you on the wrong side of that APP switch. And so then we realize, okay, if we start to address those, we actually start seeing people getting better. And in fact, if you don't address those toxins, they typically don't get better. So that's why we started to see that these are different groups as we started to measure these things.
Wonderful. And you actually answered one of the other questions that was asked, which was what toxins do you test for? So that's perfect that you covered that. I thought this was interesting. The question is, if I were to follow the plan and improve, but then fall off the plan for a few weeks, will the symptoms of cognitive decline return at that point?
Yeah, thank you so much for asking that question, because that is an excellent question. So I actually had a discussion with my mentor about 15 years ago when we were all trying to get rid of amyloid. And the idea was, well, this stuff builds up in your brain for 20 years before you get a diagnosis. So, hey, this is going to be great. If we get rid of it, then in fact, they'll have 20 years before they ever need any medicine or anything. It'll be fantastic. We'll be able to be asymptomatic. Well, it turned out to be wrong, in part because amyloid turned out to be a response. It's a protective response, completely backwards from what everybody thought. It's a protective response to these different insults. Now, so you don't want to remove it too early. You want to remove all the insults first and then begin to remove the amyloid. I think that's the way of the future. And so from very first patient, the one we called patient 0, started in 2012. And by the way, she works as a brain health coach now, doing absolutely great 8.5 years into this. And so she went off the program 4 times. She ran out of some things one time. She went on a trip one time. She goes all over the world doing different things. And she just, she ran out. She got a viral infection one time. So each time it took about 10 days for her to start declining again. So again, this is a dynamic system. Your brain is either in the mode of, yes, things are good and we're able to make and keep synapses, or it's saying things are bad and we better downsize. So this is very dynamic. And if you go off everything, and there's a threshold, you've got to get it over that threshold. So when you first start, it may take a little time, just like, by the way, what Dean Ornish found in cardiovascular disease 30 years ago. You get over that threshold, and as Dean found, you now start actually to remove your plaque, and you're now getting better blood flow. Same thing happens in the brain. You go from the synaptoclastic side, pulling back on synapses, to the synaptoblastic signaling. You're now actually making and keeping synapses. So yes, you don't want to go off everything, because within about 10 days, give or take a few, you may start to see some decline once again.
Okay, great. So there was a question which relates to the cost-benefit analysis, which you spoke to earlier, in terms of how much it does cost to take care of someone with Alzheimer's and how much you save by taking this preventive approach and this kind of holistic functional medicine approach. So the question is, has the Alzheimer's Association or other organizations been promoting that analysis or that perspective in terms of understanding the cost-benefit?
Yeah, and I think cost benefit is great until you have it yourself. And then, you're starting to say, well, wait a minute, I don't care how much the cost benefit is. I really want to do this. Having said that, absolutely. I think that the cost benefit analysis is very positive. You are saving several years in a nursing home, and you're spending something like 1 to 5% of that to keep yourself out of the nursing home, depending on what you're doing. And of course, it varies. As you know, this is personalized. This is now 21st century medicine. It's looking at what's actually driving your decline. Now, as far as the Alzheimer's Association, I've reviewed grants. We had grants from the Alzheimer's Association. I served on the National Aging Council years ago. So all of these things, we're saying that everybody was wrong about Alzheimer's before. This is not about getting a single drug. This is not about what we thought it was. The amyloid is not the bad guy. The amyloid is a protective effect that's responding. Yes, of course, it's downsizing. Again, I would make the analogy to COVID-19. This is like telling people, go shelter in place. So we've actually had quite a bit of pushback from various foundations like this who say, we don't believe it yet. Okay, well, I get it. This is like telling the Wright brothers they didn't stay up long enough while you're building the next lead balloon and saying, one of these lead balloons is going to fly. Well, the lead balloons haven't flown. Over 400 drugs now have failed in clinical trials. There hasn't been anything for this disease. So we're all going to have to think a little bit differently. And yes, there's been pushback. We're in the middle, as I said, we're in the middle of a trial now. It's just going to take, if you look at the history of scurvy, take a look at that sometime. The treatment, the cure for scurvy was discovered about 8 or 10 times. Each time the doctor or whoever discovered it would say, this really works. And the medical community would say, no, it doesn't. And they would go another century and then they would do it again. Thousands and thousands of people died because the doctors kept saying, no, it's not, no, it's not, no, it's not. So I hope the same thing doesn't happen in Alzheimer's. We're getting very good results. We're publishing the results we get. We'll see where things go with this current trial. But I think this is going to gain momentum over time. And at some point, everyone will agree, yes, this is the 21st century. We need to add to what we're doing with these monotherapeutic drug approaches.
And one final question about your recommendations for exercise, physical activity, what sort of qualities, length of time and all those things are important.
Such a great point, because, we all recognize exercise is good. Great, let's go do something. Well, we're finding that there's much more to it than that. And as an example, I mentioned EWOT earlier, which is exercise with oxygen therapy, especially for people who have any vascular component. That's type 4 Alzheimer's, where there's a lot of vascular component to it. And I talk about this in the book. Especially for those people, the EWOT, very helpful. Now, there's something else called Katsu. Katsu was developed in Japan, as you might imagine, and it actually turns out to be a way to enhance the development, enhance your exercise relatively quickly. People really seem to do well with this. All of this we'll see over time how much it actually helps with cognition. But for multiple reasons, exercise is tremendously helpful for cognition. Number one, it actually does help your insulin resistance. It helps you to become more insulin sensitive. Of course, there are all sorts of insulin receptors on muscle. So you really want to do both the muscle side and the aerobic side. On the aerobic side, you're delivering more to the brain. You're delivering oxygenation better. And then, of course, you're also improving your ketosis. The ketones have a direct effect to increase brain-derived neurotrophic factor. You're literally removing the inhibition of the production of this growth factor in your brain that has a nice anti-Alzheimer's effect. So for reason after reason after reason, and of course, better sleep, better feeling, less depression, I mean, on and on and on. Exercise is actually huge. So we urge everyone, find what you like, go out there. If you like pickleball, do that. If you like tennis, do that. If you like weightlifting, whatever it is that you love, go out there and find it and practice it, because it actually is so tremendously helpful.
Thank you, Dr. Bredesen, for just really illuminating conversation and for sharing with all of us tonight. Really appreciate your time.
Thanks very much for the great work you're doing.
So I want to just bring up a couple of slides to help conclude the evening. And I want to thank everyone who has tuned in to watch tonight. And thank you all for the good work you do in our community. We know you all do a great deal to help our community, and we do want to partner with you. So as we mentioned at the beginning, the Sutter Health IHH is a comprehensive integrative medicine program offering personalized, in-depth, holistic care. And some of our practitioners offer a functional medicine approach, specialized lab testing that we've discussed tonight. So please contact one of our clinics. And this discusses the services we offer. So we are a truly comprehensive integrative medicine clinic, and we offer a wide variety of services, including functional medicine and also Chinese medicine and acupuncture. We offer Ayurveda in a number of clinics. I know we talked about Ayurveda tonight as it pertains to brain health. We also offer psychotherapy, nutrition, counseling, massage, chiropractic, and specialized lab testing. So we do truly offer comprehensive integrative medicine, and if you contact our clinic, we can talk about what might be right for you. And we'll go on to the final slide. So again, I want to thank everyone for attending and let you know that we're very grateful for your support of IHH, and we're going to be sending you a copy of Dr. Bredesen's latest book, The End of Alzheimer's Program. You'll be getting a signed copy, and our team will be reaching out to you to see how you'd like to receive the book and also to get your feedback on this evening. So at the beginning of tonight, we started with Dr. Breyer and Dr. Stewart talking about the importance of philanthropy to realizing IHH's mission of healing people and transforming healthcare. So when the team reaches out, please let us know if you'd like to know more about how your support can advance our mission. And if you are so inclined, you can go now to the websites listed to make a donation to your local IHH Care Center. Please designate your gift to the Institute for Health and Healing from the list of programs you can support. So I want to thank everyone for tuning in and participating in the program tonight. I want to thank again Dr. Bredesen for sharing your knowledge and for really illuminating conversation. So thank you to all, and have a great evening. Bye for now.